The night I agreed to let my brother handle the paperwork, I knew I was giving something up. It was just a Tuesday, just after 7 p.m., and the kitchen clock was 5 minutes slow, like it always was. He slid the folder across the table, smiling, saying it would make things easier for everyone. I noticed his pen was already uncapped. I signed. What I did not know was that every rule I believed protected me had already been quietly rewritten. The night I agreed to let my brother handle the paperwork, it did not feel like a mistake. It felt like a favor. It was a Tuesday, just after 7, the kind of evening where the house settles into its familiar noises. The dishwasher hummed. The neighbor's porch light flicked on across the street. My kitchen clock, which I had never bothered to fix, was running 5 minutes slow. I remember noticing that because I was already tired, already thinking about how early I had to be up the next morning. We were sitting at my dining table, the one I bought secondhand when I moved into the house in Aurora, Colorado. The wood was scratched in places, and one leg was slightly shorter than the others, so it wobbled if you leaned too hard on it. I had learned to live with that. I had learned to live with a lot of small imperfections. My brother Mark sat across from me, sleeves rolled up, his phone face down near his elbow. He had driven up from Denver after work, saying he wanted to talk through a few things before the end of the month. He said it casually, the way he always did, as if nothing in life was ever urgent unless he decided it was. Nothing big, he told me when he walked in. Just stuff we should clean up. He had always been the one who cleaned things up. After our parents died, when I was still trying to figure out how to breathe without calling my mother every day, Mark stepped in and handled the estate. He talked to the lawyer. He closed accounts. He sold the car. I signed where he told me to sign back then, too. I was grateful. I told myself that was what family did. That night, he set a thin folder on the table between us. No logos, no letterhead, just a manila folder with my name written on the tab in his handwriting. He pushed it toward me with 2 fingers. "This is just formal stuff," he said. Boring, honestly. But it'll make things easier down the line. I asked what down the line meant. He smiled, the same smile he'd had since we were kids, the one that made people assume he was reasonable, dependable, safe, property, taxes, contingencies, he said. "If anything happens, you know how this state is." I did know how the state was. I worked as a zoning compliance officer for the county. My job was to read ordinances most people ignored and explain, calmly, why the rules still applied to them. I spent my days telling people no, or not yet, or you need one more permit. I believed in systems. I believed that if you followed the process, things worked the way they were supposed to. I opened the folder. Inside were a few clipped pages, neatly stacked, corners aligned. My name appeared more than once. My address was correct. Everything looked ordinary. Legal language always did, even when it was about something permanent. Mark leaned back in his chair. "It just gives me authority to speak on your behalf if there's ever a dispute. You're busy. You don't need calls from attorneys or the county assessor. I can intercept that stuff." I hesitated. Not because I didn't trust him, but because a small part of my brain, the part trained to look for fine print, wanted to slow down. I flipped through the pages, scanning phrases I recognized. Power of attorney. Limited scope. Revocable. "Why now?" I asked. He shrugged. "Because I'm here, and because you hate this stuff." That was true. I hated paperwork that had nothing to do with my job. At work, rules made sense. At home, they felt intrusive. I hated the way documents could turn something simple into something heavy. Mark slid a pen across the table. It was a cheap black pen, the kind banks handed out. I noticed the cap was already off. It was such a small thing, barely worth registering, and he didn't comment on it, neither did I. "You can revoke at any time," he said. "This doesn't take anything away from you." The dishwasher clicked off. The kitchen felt suddenly too quiet. I signed on the first line, then the second. My signature looked tired, like it always did at the end of the day, slanted slightly to the right. Mark gathered the pages immediately, tapping them into a neat stack. "See?" he said lightly. That wasn't so bad. He stayed for another 20 minutes. We talked about his kids, about traffic on I-25, about the weather turning earlier this year. When he left, he hugged me at the door and told me to lock up behind him. I did. For the next few days, nothing changed. That was the unsettling part. I went to work, I reviewed site plans, I sat in meetings where developers argued about setbacks and drainage. On Thursday, I stopped at the grocery store on the way home and ran into a woman from my office who complained about her HOA. Life stayed stubbornly normal. The first odd thing happened the following Monday, and even then, it was easy to dismiss. I opened my mailbox to find a notice from the county clerk addressed to Mark. Not forwarded, not C.O., just his name, my address. I stared at it for a moment, then set it on the counter with the rest of the mail. He probably updated something, I told myself. He probably listed my address as a contact point. It wasn't worth a phone call. 2 days later, I got an automated email from my mortgage company thanking me for recent correspondence. I hadn't contacted them. I assumed it was a glitch. Companies sent emails all the time for no reason. I deleted it. The third thing was smaller. I called the utilities office to ask about a billing discrepancy, and the woman on the phone asked if I was calling as the primary or the authorized representative. I laughed, thinking she was joking. "I'm the homeowner," I said. "Yes," she replied, polite and firm. "But we also have Mr. Mark Harlan listed with full authorization." I felt a flicker of irritation then, sharp but brief. Mark should have told me he'd started using the document already. I made a mental note to ask him about it later. That night, I stood in my kitchen, leaning against the counter, staring at the same clock that still ran 5 minutes slow. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that if something was wrong, I would see it clearly, all at once, the way problems usually revealed themselves. What I did not know, standing there in my socks with my work bag still on the floor, was that the rules I enforced every day did not protect people who trusted the wrong person. I did not know that the authority I had casually handed over was already being used, quietly, efficiently, in ways I had never imagined. At that moment, my life still looked like my own. My name was still on the door, my routines were intact, but somewhere between that signed page and the mail in my box, the ground had shifted. And everything I believed about control, about fairness, about family, was already beginning to collapse. Before everything tilted, my life was defined by predictability. Not excitement, not ambition in the way people talked about it on podcasts, but a steady sense of order. I woke up at the same time every morning, brewed coffee strong enough to taste slightly burnt, and drove the same route to the county building. I liked knowing where I would be at 8:47 a.m. I liked knowing which intersection would back up and which one never did. I had worked for the county for 12 years. Zoning compliance was not glamorous, but it was concrete. There were maps, parcel numbers, ordinances, written in black ink that did not bend for anyone's feelings. People assumed my job was about power, about telling them what they could not do. In reality, it was about boundaries. About making sure one person's choices did not quietly erode someone else's rights. I believed in that. I believed that systems existed for a reason. The house I lived in was small, but it was mine. A single-story ranch tucked into a quiet subdivision where nothing ever happened fast. I bought it after my divorce, when I decided I wanted something no one could take from me just by changing their mind. No joint ownership, no shared leverage. I paid extra every month toward the principal because I liked watching the balance go down. It made me feel anchored. Mark used to tease me about it. "You're obsessed with control," he'd say, laughing. "You should learn to let go." Incense for minest. What he did not understand was that control, to me, was not about dominance. It was about safety. About knowing that if something went wrong, I could trace it back to a rule, a document, a decision I had made, with my eyes open. After our parents died, that sense of control became more important, not less. Mark had been the older one, the charismatic one. He worked in private consulting now, advising companies on regulatory strategy, which sounded impressive even when you did not understand what it meant. He talked easily. He knew how to sound certain. People trusted him without realizing they were doing it. I trusted him, too. In the years after the estate was settled, we slipped into a quiet rhythm. Sunday phone calls. Holidays rotated between his place and mine. I babysat his kids when his wife traveled. He helped me fix a leaking faucet once and never let me forget it. "You'd fall apart without me," he joked, tightening the wrench. I laughed because it was easier than questioning why the joke bothered me. The value that mattered most to me was not the house itself. It was the life attached to it. My address determined my school district for the after-school program I volunteered with. It tied me to a specific voting precinct. It grounded my professional credibility. When I stood in front of a room explaining zoning variances, people assumed I understood property because I lived inside the rules myself. I did not think of that as fragile. I thought of it as solid. The first time I sensed something was off, I brushed it aside because it did not threaten anything tangible. It was a conversation at work, in the break room, while I waited for my lunch to reheat. One of the clerks mentioned that a request had come in under my parcel number, routed through a third party. "Probably a title check," I said without thinking. She frowned. "It wasn't from a bank." I shrugged. "Then it's nothing." That was the pattern. Each moment, on its own, was nothing. A forwarded email, a phone call I did not receive because someone else had answered it. A letter that arrived already opened, placed neatly on my kitchen counter with the envelope folded underneath as if to be helpful. Mark never mentioned any of it. When we spoke, he sounded normal, relaxed. He asked about my work. He complained about his clients. He did not sound like someone hiding anything. When I finally brought it up, it was casual, a text message while I was waiting in line at the post office. "Hey, did you list yourself as my contact for some things? I got a notice addressed to you," he replied almost immediately. "Yeah, that's what the paperwork was for. Saves you time." The words settled uncomfortably in my chest. Not wrong, just heavier than they should have been. I told myself I was overreacting. I had signed the document willingly. I had read enough of it to know it was revocable. If I wanted to undo it, I could. That was the rule. That was the system. What I did not account for was how quickly perception could change once someone else began speaking for you. How authority, once delegated, did not announce itself when it crossed lines. At a neighborhood association meeting, the chair thanked me for working with my brother on an upcoming zoning concern. I stared at her, confused. "I haven't," I said. She smiled politely. "He called last week, very proactive." Proactive. The word followed me home that night, echoing in my head as I unlocked my door. I stood in the entryway longer than necessary, listening to the quiet. The house still smelled like lemon cleaner from the weekend. Everything was exactly where I left it. I went to my desk and opened my laptop, pulling up my county portal login. Nothing looked different. My name still appeared at the top. My credentials were intact. I scrolled through records, looking for anything out of place, but everything was technically in order. That was the problem. Everything was technically in order. I called Mark the next morning. He answered on the second ring. "You didn't mention the HOA meeting," I said. He paused for half a second. It was brief, but I caught it. "I didn't think it mattered," he replied. "They were going to ask questions anyway. I just clarified things." Clarified. Another harmless word. "You should have told me," I said. He sighed, the sound of someone inconvenienced. "You're being sensitive. I'm helping you." The conversation ended there, unresolved, hanging between us like humidity before a storm. At work, I sat through a hearing where a homeowner accused the county of overreach. I explained the ordinance calmly, professionally, using the same phrases I had used 100 times before. Inside, something felt misaligned. For the first time in years, I questioned whether knowing the rules was enough, whether belief in structure could protect someone when the threat wore a familiar face. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table, the same one that wobbled if leaned on too hard. I placed the folder Mark had left back in front of me, flipping through it slowly this time. The language had not changed, the meaning had not changed, but I had. I realized then that the value being threatened was not my house, not my money, not even my legal standing. It was my voice. The quiet, steady authority I had built over a lifetime of following rules and expecting others to do the same. And I understood, with a clarity that made my stomach drop, that once your voice was filtered through someone else, getting it back would not be simple. Not even in a system designed to be fair. When I look back now, what unsettles me most is not what Mark did later, but how natural our arrangement felt before I questioned it. There was no dramatic shift, no single moment where he stepped into my life and declared himself in charge. It happened the way vines creep along a fence, slowly enough that you do not notice until the structure underneath begins to disappear. Mark had always been the decisive one. Even as kids, he spoke for both of us. At parent-teacher conferences, he answered questions meant for me. At family gatherings, he told stories that made us sound closer than we were. I let him. It was easier. People listened to him. He liked that. And I liked not having to fight for space. After college, our paths diverged in ways that reinforced that dynamic. He went into consulting, learned the language of strategy and leverage, learned how to sound confident even when the details were vague. I went into public service, where every word had to be backed by a code section or a written finding. He teased me for it. You hide behind rules, he'd say. I create outcomes. I told myself we balanced each other. The years after my divorce were when I leaned on him the most. Not financially, but emotionally. I had made the decision to leave a marriage that looked fine on paper, but hollowed me out in private. Mark had supported me then, or at least I thought he had. He helped me move. He told me I was brave. He reminded me that starting over was a strength, not a failure. Just don't make it harder than it needs to be, he said often. You always do that. I absorbed that message without realizing it. I began to see my caution as a flaw, my insistence on understanding every detail as unnecessary friction. When Mark offered to step in, to handle things, I felt relief instead of alarm. That was the real exchange. Not paperwork for authority, but trust for comfort. Our relationship operated on unspoken assumptions. He assumed I would defer. I assumed he would protect me. Neither of us ever articulated those expectations out loud, which made them impossible to challenge later. The night he brought the folder to my house, he framed it as a favor, something temporary, something reversible. He spoke the language I trusted, referencing processes, contingencies, the way things worked in Colorado. He did not rush me, but he did not encourage questions either. He filled the silence with reassurance until signing felt like the path of least resistance. I told myself that was reasonable. Mark was family. Family did not exploit loopholes. In the weeks that followed, I began to notice how often other people referred to him when talking about me. A contractor I had never met called to confirm a timeline Mark had apparently discussed. A city clerk asked me to verify a statement your brother submitted on your behalf. Each time, the exchange ended politely, with an apology for the confusion. But confusion has weight. It accumulates. The turning point, though I did not recognize it as such at the time, came during a routine meeting at work. I was presenting an update on a rezoning proposal when my supervisor interrupted me. Before we move on, she said, glancing at her notes, I just want to clarify something. We received correspondence regarding your property and potential conflict of interest. The room went quiet. My stomach tightened. From whom? I asked. She hesitated. Your brother. He wanted to make sure everything was above board. I nodded automatically, my face calm, my voice steady as I explained there was no conflict, that my work was unrelated to my residence. The meeting continued. No one questioned me further. On paper, the issue resolved itself. But something had shifted. Mark had inserted himself into my professional world without asking. He had spoken in my name, preemptively, positioning himself as a safeguard against suspicion I had never attracted. That night, I lay awake longer than usual, replaying the moment. It was not what he said that bothered me. It was that he had decided it was necessary. When I called him the next day, he sounded defensive before I even finished the sentence. You're welcome, he said. I headed off a problem before it became one. You created the impression there was a problem, I replied. He laughed softly. That's how you think because you live inside the rules. I live in the real world. There it was. The dividing line he had always drawn between us, now sharpened. I didn't ask you to do that, I said. "You didn't need to," he answered. "That's the whole point." The conversation ended abruptly, his tone clipped, mine tight. For the first time, I felt the imbalance clearly. He believed his judgment superseded my consent. He believed his role was not to assist, but to decide. In the days that followed, I tried to reassert myself in small ways. I asked to be included on emails. I corrected people when they referred to Mark as my representative. I told myself these were normal boundary adjustments, nothing more. But Mark responded with irritation, not understanding. "You're making this messy," he said during one call. "You wanted help. Now you're micromanaging." Micromanaging. Another word that painted my caution as a problem. I started to question my own reactions. Was I overreacting? Had I invited this by accepting his help in the first place? The doubt crept in quietly, eroding my confidence one interaction at a time. And yet, beneath the doubt, something else was growing. A recognition that the trust I had placed in him was being leveraged, not honored. That the relationship we had relied on depended on my silence more than my consent. I did not yet know what he was doing with the authority I had given him. I did not yet understand the scope of it, but I knew, with a certainty that made my chest ache, that whatever came next would not be resolved by a simple conversation. The system I believed in required transparency. Mark operated in shadows, and as long as I continued to assume our goals were aligned, he would continue to move pieces on a board I did not realize I was playing on. That was the moment I stopped seeing him as my protector, and the moment I began to understand that the most dangerous betrayals do not come from malice, but from certainty, the certainty that someone knows what is best for you better than you ever could. The first concrete sign that something was wrong arrived disguised as routine correspondence. It came on a Friday afternoon, tucked between a grocery store flyer and a postcard from my aunt in New Mexico. The envelope bore the seal of the county recorder's office, the kind of thing I handled daily at work without a second thought. I slid it open, standing at the kitchen counter, already thinking about what to make for dinner. Inside was a notice confirming the receipt of amended documentation related to my property. Not a warning, not a problem, just a confirmation. The language was dry, neutral, almost comforting in its impersonality. I read it twice before the words landed. Amended documentation. I set the paper down and leaned against the counter, my heartbeat suddenly loud in my ears. Amendments did not happen spontaneously. They were initiated, filed, logged. I knew the process because I enforced it for other people. I had not initiated anything. My first instinct was to check for an error. Offices misfiled documents all the time. Clerks mistyped parcel numbers. That was the reasonable explanation, the one that did not require me to confront anything uncomfortable. I logged into the recorder's portal and pulled up my property record. The page loaded slowly, the spinning icon irritating me more than it should have. When the information appeared, everything looked familiar at first glance. Same address, same legal description, same purchase date. Then I noticed the line beneath my name. Authorized agent, Mark Harlan. I stared at the screen, my mind refusing to interpret what my eyes were seeing. Authorized agent did not mean owner. It did not mean transfer. It was not catastrophic on its own. But it meant access. It meant permission. It meant that someone else could submit, receive, and respond to documents related to my home without my involvement. I closed the laptop and opened it again, as if the line might disappear the second time. It did not. I called the recorder's office, keeping my voice even, professional. The woman who answered sounded young, efficient. "I'm calling about a recent amendment on my property file," I said. "I believe it may have been submitted in error." She asked for my parcel number. I gave it to her from memory. "Oh yes," she said after a pause. "Your agent submitted an update earlier this week." "My agent?" I repeated. "Yes, your brother." Everything was in order. "What exactly was updated?" I asked. There was a brief clicking sound as she pulled up the record. Contact authorizations, notification preferences, standard housekeeping. Housekeeping. The word landed wrong. "Did he submit anything else?" I asked. "No, ma'am. That's all." And it was out of comb. I thanked her and hung up, my hand shaking slightly as I set the phone down. Nothing she said was alarming on its own. No red flags, no violations. Everything, once again, was technically in order. That night, I slept poorly. I dreamed of hallways that kept narrowing, doors that closed just as I reached them. When I woke up, the unease did not fade with the morning light. Over the next week, the pattern repeated. Small things, a letter from the tax assessor addressed jointly to me and Mark, an email confirming receipt of an inquiry I had never made, a contractor leaving a voicemail thanking me for the discussion yesterday, a discussion I had not had. Each time, I told myself it was administrative noise. Each time, I felt a little less steady. I finally confronted Mark on a Sunday afternoon. We met at a coffee shop halfway between our houses, a neutral place with too many people and not enough privacy. He arrived late, carrying his phone and a look of mild annoyance. "What's going on?" I asked once we sat down. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply laid the facts out the way I would in a report. He listened, nodding, then waved a hand dismissively. "That's exactly what we talked about. Streamlining." "You didn't say you'd be filing amendments," I said. "They're not amendments in the way you're thinking," he replied. "They don't change anything substantive. They change who speaks for me," I said. He sighed. "You're reading into this. You signed the document." "I signed a limited authorization," I said. "Not a blank check." Mark leaned back, crossing his arms. "You're making this adversarial." The word stung because it reframed the issue. Suddenly, I was not someone asking reasonable questions. I was someone creating conflict. "I just want transparency," I said. "And I'm telling you there's nothing to worry about," he replied, his tone firm. "Why can't you trust that?" Because trust was no longer theoretical. It had consequences now. The conversation ended without resolution. He left early, saying he had another commitment. I sat there long after, watching people come and go, wondering how a relationship that had felt so stable could suddenly feel so precarious. The strangest part was how calm Mark seemed throughout it all. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He did not pressure me overtly. He simply behaved as though his actions were self-evidently justified, as though my discomfort was an unfortunate side effect of his competence. In the weeks that followed, I began to notice how my absence from conversations became normalized. Decisions were made without me. Information reached me after the fact, filtered through Mark's explanations. When I asked to be included, the response was always the same. "You don't need to worry about that." I started documenting everything. Dates, times, who said what. It was a habit from work, one I had relied on countless times to establish patterns. I told myself it was precautionary, nothing more. But privately, I felt something colder taking root, a recognition that the man I had trusted to simplify my life was, intentionally or not, erasing my participation in it. The most unsettling moment came late one evening when I returned home to find a survey marker staked into my front yard. A small wooden post with a bright ribbon tied around it, fluttering gently in the breeze. I stood there for a long moment, staring at it. I had not requested a survey. I called Mark immediately. He did not answer. I left a message, my voice steady despite the adrenaline buzzing under my skin. "There's a marker in my yard," I said. "If you know why, you need to tell me. Now." He called back an hour later. "Oh, that," he said casually. "Don't worry about it. It is not formant." "Why is there a survey marker on my property?" I asked. "Just preliminary work," he replied. "It doesn't mean anything yet." Yet. That word echoed in my mind long after we hung up. I went inside, locked the door, and sat at my kitchen table, the same one that wobbled if leaned on too hard. I placed the recorder's notice, the tax letter, and my handwritten notes in front of me. Individually, none of it proved anything. Collectively, it told a story I did not want to believe. Something was being built around me. Quietly, methodically. Decisions were being staged, groundwork laid, all without my consent, and the man orchestrating it believed he was doing me a favor. I realized then that waiting for a single, undeniable violation was a mistake. By the time something crossed that line, the damage would already be done. The warning signs were not dramatic. They were administrative, procedural, boring. And that was what made them dangerous. By the time I understood that something fundamental had shifted, the imbalance had already become routine. That was the part I struggled with most later, explaining it to myself in quiet moments. Not that Mark had taken control, but that the taking had been so subtle it felt almost voluntary. The survey marker remained in my yard for 3 days. I stepped around it each morning on my way to work, pretending it was nothing more than an inconvenience, like a fallen branch or a misplaced trash bin. On the 4th day, it was gone. No explanation. No follow-up. Just an absence where something unsettling had been. I did not feel relieved. I felt watched. At work, I began noticing how often my name came up in conversations I was not part of. A colleague mentioned a call from your representative regarding future land use planning near my subdivision. Another asked if I was still recusing myself from a committee assignment because of family involvement. "I'm not recusing myself," I said, more sharply than I intended. She blinked. "Oh, that's not what we were told." Told by whom went unsaid. The strangest thing was how reasonable everything sounded when filtered through Mark. He never described his actions as decisions. They were precautions, safeguards, temporary measures until things were clearer, until markets stabilized, until regulations shifted. There was always an external reason, something abstract and distant, something that justified acting now and informing me later. When I objected, he framed it as resistance to efficiency. "You're clinging to formality," he said during one phone call. "That's not how things get done." "And yet," I replied, "formality is the reason you're allowed to act at all." End quote. He laughed softly, the sound of someone indulging a stubborn child. "You're missing the bigger picture." The bigger picture was always just out of reach, just vague enough that I could not challenge it directly. I began to understand how people ended up sidelined in their own lives, not through force, but through narratives that painted them as obstacles to progress. The power shift became most visible in my interactions with third parties. People stopped asking for my input. They informed me instead. A zoning consultant emailed to confirm a timeline Mark had approved. A title company called to verify details he had already provided. Each time, I corrected them. Each time, the correction was received politely, then quietly ignored. I started feeling like a guest in conversations about my own property. One afternoon, I received a calendar invitation for a meeting I had not scheduled. The subject line read, "Preliminary Discussion, Harlan Property." My address was listed beneath it. Mark was the organizer. I stared at the screen for a long moment before accepting. If decisions were being made, I wanted to be in the room. The meeting took place over video conference. Mark appeared on screen relaxed, confident, his bookshelf neatly arranged behind him. 2 other participants joined, a land use attorney and a development consultant. They greeted me cordially, then turned their attention back to Mark. He led the conversation effortlessly, referencing documents, outlining scenarios, speaking as though he were the primary stakeholder. I interjected when I could, asking questions, clarifying points, but my voice felt smaller than usual, as if the space itself resisted my presence. At one point, the attorney addressed Mark directly. "As authorized agent, you'll need to confirm the next steps." I leaned forward. "I need to confirm them," I said. "It's my property." There was an awkward pause. Mark smiled. "Of course. This is just preliminary." Preliminary. Again. After the call ended, I sat at my desk, staring at my reflection in the darkened screen. I felt embarrassed, not because I had spoken up, but because doing so had felt disruptive, as though asserting my own authority required justification. That night, I pulled out the document I had signed and read it line by line, slowly, carefully. The language was clear. Limited scope, revocable at will. On paper, I still held the power. In practice, power had momentum. And Mark had been building it steadily, interaction by interaction, until reversing course felt like an overreaction. I drafted an email revoking the authorization. I wrote it once, deleted it, wrote it again. Each time, I hesitated, imagining the fallout, the family tension, the accusations of ingratitude, the way Mark would frame it to others. You're panicking. You're overthinking. You're sabotaging your own interests. The words were not spoken aloud, but they lived in my head, familiar and persuasive. Days passed. More emails, more phone calls routed through Mark, more moments where I was informed, not consulted. I felt myself shrinking in subtle ways, choosing silence to avoid confrontation, telling myself I would address it later, when I had more information. That was the trap. Waiting for clarity while the ground continued to move. The tipping point came not with a legal document, but with a conversation that should have been simple. I stopped by the county clerk's office after work to ask a question in person, hoping to cut through the layers of miscommunication. The clerk recognized me, smiled, then hesitated. "Oh," she said, "I thought you knew. We usually coordinate through your brother." I stood there, my badge still clipped to my jacket, my identity split cleanly in two. In that moment, I saw the full picture. How easily authority migrated to the loudest, most confident voice. How systems assumed alignment unless told otherwise. How my silence had been interpreted as consent. I went home and sat in my car in the driveway longer than necessary, hands resting on the steering wheel, heart pounding. The house looked the same as it always had. Lights off, curtains drawn, nothing visibly wrong. Inside, I laid everything out on the dining table. Notices, emails, notes, the signed document. I traced the pattern backward, seeing how each small concession had led here, not to a single catastrophic act, but to a steady erosion of agency. Mark had not locked me out. He had simply stepped in front of me. I understood then that this was no longer about paperwork or property. It was about whether I was willing to reclaim my voice at the cost of peace. Whether I was willing to be seen as difficult, ungrateful, uncooperative. The imbalance was clear now. He spoke. Others listened. I objected. They waited for him to respond. As long as that dynamic held, the outcome was inevitable. I picked up my phone and opened my email draft once more. This time, I did not delete it, because I finally understood that losing quietly was still losing, and that the longer I waited to push back, the harder it would be to prove that my silence had never been consent at all. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, folded once and slipped through my mail slot sometime between noon and 6. I knew the exact window because I had checked the mail at lunch, out of habit, and again when I got home. The envelope was thicker than usual, heavier in a way that made my stomach tighten before I even read the return address. It was from the city planning department. I sat down at the kitchen table before opening it, the chair scraping softly against the floor. The room felt unusually still, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I slid a finger under the flap and pulled the pages out slowly, careful not to tear anything. The first line thanked me for my cooperation. I read it again, slower this time. Cooperation implied participation, consent, an ongoing process I had agreed to be part of. The letter outlined a preliminary review of a proposed rezoning request affecting several parcels in my area, including mine. It emphasized that no final determination had been made, that the process was still in its early stages. Public comment would be solicited, notices would be sent, all standard language, all very reasonable. What made my hands start to shake was the sentence buried halfway down the page. Based on correspondence received from the authorized representative, the property owner has expressed openness to exploring alternative land use options. I stared at that sentence until the words blurred. Openness, exploring, options. I had expressed nothing of the sort. This was not a denial, not an approval, not even a decision. On paper, it was insignificant. A procedural acknowledgement. The kind of thing I reviewed and signed off on regularly at work without a second thought. But this time, I was on the other side of it. And I understood exactly what it meant. It meant a narrative had been established without me. I read the letter from start to finish, then folded it carefully and placed it on the table next to my notes. My chest felt tight, my breathing shallow. I told myself to slow down. Panic would not help. I needed information. I called the number listed at the bottom of the page. A planner I recognized by name answered. Her voice was warm, professional. I received a letter regarding my property, I said. I think there may be some confusion. She paused. Oh? We've been coordinating through your brother. I am not interested in rezoning, I said. I have never indicated otherwise. There was a longer pause this time. He indicated you were open to discussion. Discussion is not consent, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I understand, she replied. This is just the early stage. Early stage. Again. When we hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at the wall. The situation was finally concrete enough that I could no longer explain it away. This was not housekeeping, not efficiency, not help. This was direction. I called Mark immediately. He did not answer. I called again, straight to voicemail. Why did you tell the city I was open to rezoning? I asked when the beep sounded. You had no authority to do that. Call me back. He did not. I barely slept that night. My mind replayed every interaction from the past 2 months, every moment I had chosen silence over confrontation. By morning, exhaustion had stripped away the last of my hesitation. I went to work early and requested a meeting with my supervisor. I laid out the facts plainly, just as I would expect someone else to do. The signed authorization, the correspondence, the rezoning letter. She listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious by the minute. This could become a conflict issue, she said carefully, not because of what you've done, but because of perception. Perception, the same word Mark had been managing all along. I need to correct the record, I said. Yes, she agreed. You do. That afternoon, I sent a formal email to the planning department, copying the recorder's office, the tax assessor, and Mark. The language was precise, restrained, unmistakable. I revoked the authorization, effective immediately. I stated clearly that any representations made on my behalf without my explicit, written consent were unauthorized. I requested written confirmation. When I hit send, my hands were trembling, but my mind felt strangely calm. For the first time in weeks, my actions aligned with my instincts. Mark called me an hour later. What the hell did you do? He demanded, skipping pleasantries. I corrected a misrepresentation, I said. You embarrassed me, he snapped. You blindsided everyone. Oh, game. You blindsided me first, I replied. You crossed a line. He laughed, sharp and humorless. You don't even know what you just did. The words hung between us, heavy with implication. I know exactly what I did, I said. I took my voice back. He exhaled slowly. You're making a mistake. You don't understand how this works. I understand enough, I said. You are no longer authorized to act for me, in any capacity. Silence followed. Then his tone shifted, lower, controlled. You're going to regret this. The call ended. In the days that followed, the fallout began. Emails arrived requesting clarification. Meetings were postponed. People who had previously deferred to Mark now reached out to me directly, cautiously, as if uncertain which version of the story would prevail. At the same time, subtle pressure mounted. A family member called to ask why I was causing problems. A mutual friend suggested I apologize to keep the peace. The message was consistent. I had disrupted something that had been working, and that disruption was my fault. The city confirmed receipt of my revocation. The planning department acknowledged my position. On paper, everything reset. But the damage was already done. The rezoning request remained active. My name was attached to a process I had not initiated. Even if it went nowhere, the fact that it existed altered how my property was viewed, how my intentions were interpreted. More importantly, it altered how Mark viewed me. He stopped pretending his actions were for my benefit. When we spoke, his frustration was palpable. You don't get to pull the plug halfway through, he said during one heated exchange. You gave me authority. People relied on that. I gave you limited authority, I replied. You abused it. That's your opinion. No, I said quietly. That's a fact. The realization settled in fully then, heavy and undeniable. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a contest of narratives, of credibility, of who would be believed when the dust settled. The triggering event was not catastrophic. No bulldozers, No eviction notices, no dramatic confrontation. Just a letter, just a sentence. Just enough to show me that what was at stake was not hypothetical. Everything after this would be deliberate. I no longer had the luxury of assuming good intentions. I would have to prove, step by step, that my consent had limits and that crossing them carried consequences. Standing in my kitchen that night, the rezoning letter folded neatly on the table, I understood something with absolute clarity. This was the point of no return. Whatever came next, the relationship I thought I had with my brother was already gone. And the system I trusted would only protect me if I knew how to use it, against someone who understood it just as well and was willing to bend it further. From this moment on, I would not be reacting. I would be preparing. The clarity did not arrive with anger. That surprised me. I had expected fury, the kind that tightens your jaw and makes your hands shake. Instead, what settled over me in the days after I revoked Mark's authority was something quieter, heavier, and far more durable: detachment. For the first time since this began, I stopped asking myself why he had done it. I stopped trying to map his actions onto my own values, searching for the version of events where we were still aligned. That mental habit had kept me trapped, replaying conversations, dissecting tone, wondering where I had misunderstood him. The truth was simpler than I wanted it to be. Mark and I were operating under entirely different definitions of care. To him, care meant control, anticipation, deciding outcomes before other people could complicate them. He did not see himself as taking anything from me. He saw himself as managing risk, streamlining decisions, removing friction. In his mind, my discomfort was collateral damage, not harm. Once I accepted that, the fog lifted. I began noticing how often he used the language of inevitability. This is where things are heading. This is how it's done now. You can't stop progress. Each phrase carried the same underlying message: resistance was pointless. The role he assigned me was not partner or equal, but variable. Understanding that changed how I listened. When he called again, his voice calmer than before, I heard calculation beneath the concern. "You've put yourself in a bad position," he said. "People are confused. People are informed," I replied. "That's not the same thing." I did not argue. I no longer needed to convince him. The conversation was not about truth. It was about dominance. After we hung up, I sat at my desk and made a decision that felt oddly unemotional. I stopped engaging him directly. No more explanations. No more justifications. If he contacted me, I responded briefly, in writing, sticking to verifiable facts. The shift unnerved him. He began escalating in subtle ways. Not threats, exactly, but implications. Mentions of market forces, of bigger players, of consequences I would face if I did not adapt. He framed himself as the buffer standing between me and something worse. I recognized the tactic immediately. It was the same one I saw developers use when pressuring homeowners to sell. Create urgency, invoke inevitability, position resistance as irrational. That recognition brought something close to relief. At work, I started consulting colleagues in departments adjacent to mine, asking hypothetical questions without revealing names. I wanted to understand how similar situations had played out, how authority was challenged, how narratives were corrected once they had taken hold. What I learned was sobering. Systems were fair, but only if you engaged them fully. Silence was interpreted as acquiescence. Delay favored whoever was already acting. I went home that night and pulled every relevant document I could find: deeds, correspondence, emails, meeting notes. I organized them chronologically, not by importance, but by sequence. I wanted to see the progression, the slow tightening of control. Looking at it laid out that way, the pattern was unmistakable. Each step Mark took made the next one easier. Each time I hesitated, the space he occupied expanded. This was not impulsive, it was strategic. The realization did not make me angry. It made me precise. I stopped framing my actions as responses to Mark and started framing them as protection of myself. That distinction mattered. It stripped away the emotional weight and replaced it with purpose. I updated my personal records, changed notification preferences back to my name only, requested written confirmation from every office that my brother was no longer authorized to receive or submit information on my behalf. I did it systematically, one department at a time, checking off tasks the way I did at work. With each confirmation, I felt a small measure of stability return. Mark noticed the change immediately. "You're shutting me out," he said during one call. His tone wounded. "I'm setting boundaries," I replied. "That's the same thing." "No," I said calmly. "It isn't." The silence that followed was different from before. Not tense, but assessing. He was recalibrating, deciding how to approach me now that the old dynamics no longer applied. That was when I understood something else. Something that would later guide every decision I made. Mark did not believe he was wrong. In his mind, he was still the responsible one, the visionary, the person willing to make hard decisions others avoided. He saw my resistance not as a moral stand, but as fear, inconvenience, an emotional reaction to complexity. That belief made him dangerous. Not because he wanted to hurt me, but because he felt justified, because he believed outcomes mattered more than consent, because he was certain that history would prove him right. I stopped expecting remorse. I stopped waiting for acknowledgement. Those were never coming. Instead, I began preparing for something else entirely. Exposure. Not public humiliation, not retaliation, but clarity, the kind that left no room for reinterpretation, the kind that forced systems to respond, not to personalities, but to evidence. That required patience and distance. I took a week off work and stayed home, not to rest, but to observe, to watch how information moved now that I had disrupted the flow, to see who reached out, who hesitated, who deferred. Patterns emerged quickly. Some people adapted without comment. Others seemed uncertain, waiting for Mark to reassert himself. A few, surprisingly, expressed quiet support, telling me they had wondered why he had been so involved in the first place. Those moments mattered more than they seemed. They confirmed what I had suspected. Authority was not as absolute as it felt. It was sustained by habit, not inevitability. Late one night, sitting alone at the kitchen table, I realized something that changed how I saw the entire situation. Mark had not taken my power in a single act. He had relied on my belief that harmony was more valuable than agency, that family required flexibility, that pushing back was unnecessary, even unkind. Once that belief collapsed, his leverage weakened. I no longer felt compelled to preserve the relationship at all costs. I no longer needed his approval. I no longer feared being perceived as difficult. What I feared now was complacency. The clarity I had reached was not comforting. It demanded action. It required me to accept that the relationship I thought I had with my brother was built on a misunderstanding I had participated in. That acceptance was not painful in the way loss usually is. It was sobering, like realizing a bridge you trusted had always been unstable. From that point on, I approached every interaction with one guiding principle. If something could be misused, it would be. If something could be reinterpreted, it would be. That was not paranoia. It was realism. And as I sat there, the house quiet around me, the clock still running 5 minutes slow, I understood that this clarity was irreversible. I could not unsee the pattern. I could not return to the version of myself who assumed alignment where none existed. Whatever Mark did next would no longer surprise me. And whatever I did next would be intentional. Once I stopped reacting and started observing, the story began to reveal itself in fragments. Not dramatic revelations, not a single incriminating document waiting to be discovered, but a series of small confirmations that, together, formed something undeniable. I did not hire a private investigator. I did not confront anyone loudly or demand answers. I did what I had always done best. I followed processes. I read records. I asked careful questions that sounded hypothetical and harmless. I started with public filings. Everything Mark had touched left a trail, even when he believed it did not. County databases logged timestamps. Email servers archived headers, meeting calendars, recorded organizers, and attendees. None of it told a story on its own, but I was no longer looking for a story. I was looking for sequence. The first pattern emerged in the timing. Mark's communications with the city planning department had begun weeks before he ever brought the folder to my house. Not formally, not under my name, but as initial outreach. Exploratory questions, requests for clarification, all things that could be defended as curiosity. But curiosity has direction. Every inquiry pointed toward the same outcome: reclassification of land use that would increase density allowances in my area. Not immediately, not aggressively, just enough to open doors that had previously been closed. I cross-referenced those dates with his client schedule, something he had once shown me proudly, scrolling through appointments on his phone while talking about how busy he was. A particular gap stood out. Several hours blocked off, labeled only as local, as if geography alone explained intent. I requested copies of meeting summaries from the planning department, citing my status as the property owner. They arrived 3 days later, sanitized but informative. Mark's name appeared repeatedly, always framed as my representative, always careful to emphasize that nothing was final, that all decisions would involve me eventually. What struck me was how often my absence was noted without concern. No one questioned why I was not present. No one insisted on hearing from me directly. The system assumed alignment unless challenged. That assumption had been Mark's greatest asset. I moved next to communications that were not public record. Emails forwarded to me after the fact. Calendar invitations I had declined or never received. Each one was a small act of exclusion, defensible on its own, but unmistakable in aggregate. Then there were the conversations I was never meant to know about. I learned about those by accident. The way most truths surface. A former colleague from the county, now working in the private sector, called to ask if I was finally cashing out. "What are you talking about?" I asked. He laughed. "Your brother's been telling people you're tired of holding on to that house, that you're open to options." I closed my eyes slowly. "I've never said that." "Well," he replied, hesitating, "that's not how it's being presented." That was when the final piece clicked into place. This was not about my property alone. It was about leverage. Mark was positioning himself as the conduit through which access flowed, to me, to my land, to decisions I was supposed to make later, once the groundwork had been laid so thoroughly that refusal would seem unreasonable. In that context, the rezoning letter was not a misstep. It was a milestone. I began documenting everything more formally, not notes on scraps of paper, but organized files with sources, dates, and corroboration. I did not label anything evidence. That word implied accusation. I labeled it record. The difference mattered. As I built the record, another realization surfaced, one that made my stomach tighten. Mark had not acted alone. Not in the sense of conspirators or accomplices, but in the way influence spreads. He had spoken to consultants, attorneys, planners, developers. None of them had done anything illegal. They had simply responded to the person who appeared to have authority, and he had used my silence as proof of consent. That was the hardest part to accept. Not that he had misrepresented me, but that my previous deference had made his version of events plausible. I stopped blaming myself for that. Blame was unproductive. Understanding was not. I requested one more set of documents, this time from a title company Mark had contacted early on. The request took longer to process, but when it came, it confirmed what I already suspected: preliminary inquiries, hypothetical scenarios, financial projections based on rezoning outcomes that assumed my participation. Assumed. That word appeared repeatedly, always in small print, always buried beneath disclaimers. Enough to protect them, enough to expose him. I did not confront Mark with this information, not yet. Confrontation would only give him a chance to reframe, to adjust his narrative. Instead, I prepared. I consulted an attorney, not to sue, but to understand my position. I laid everything out calmly, without embellishment. He listened carefully, then nodded. "This isn't criminal," he said, "but it's coercive." The word felt heavy and precise. "Can I stop it?" I asked. "You already have," he replied. "But you need to be prepared for pushback. He's invested now." Invested. Another neutral word that carried weight. The attorney advised me to continue documenting, to communicate only in writing, to avoid emotional language, to let the record speak. I left his office feeling steadier than I had in weeks. When Mark reached out again, his tone was different, not angry, persuasive. "You're misunderstanding my intentions," he said. "I'm trying to create options." "Options for whom?" I asked. "For you," he replied without hesitation. That certainty told me everything I needed to know. I realized then that the evidence I had gathered was not meant to destroy him, it was meant to anchor me, to give me confidence when he tried to pull the conversation back into abstraction, into hypotheticals and inevitabilities. I no longer needed him to admit anything. I did not need an apology. I needed boundaries that held under pressure. Late one evening, after organizing the last of the files, I sat back and looked at the stack of documents spread across my table. It was not dramatic, no smoking gun, no single act of betrayal, just a clear, methodical pattern of overreach, justified by confidence and familiarity. The kind of pattern that thrived on people not wanting to make a fuss. I understood then that the hardest part was over, not because the conflict was resolved, but because I had stopped doubting my own perception. The truth was no longer fragile. It did not depend on how convincingly Mark spoke or how calmly he smiled. It was written down. And once something is written down, it stops being a disagreement and starts being a fact. That was when I knew I was ready for whatever came next. What unsettled me most, as the record took shape, was not the scale of what Mark had attempted, but the consistency of his reasoning. Every action fit neatly into a worldview he had never bothered to question. Once I saw that, the anger I had expected still did not arrive. What came instead was something closer to comprehension, and that was far more disquieting. Mark genuinely believed he was right. Not in a defensive way, not with the nervous overcompensation of someone hiding guilt. He believed it, with the calm assurance of a person who has spent his life being rewarded for stepping in where others hesitated. In his world, momentum mattered more than permission, outcomes mattered more than process, and people who slowed things down were not wrong, just inefficient. That belief explained everything. When I replayed our conversations with that lens, his tone made sense. The patience, the indulgent sighs, the way he framed my objections as emotional reactions rather than principled ones. He did not see himself as violating my trust. He saw himself as correcting my limitations. Once I accepted that, I stopped expecting him to behave like someone who knew he had crossed a line. He did not feel he had crossed anything. From his perspective, I was the one deviating from an agreed-upon path. I tested that understanding in our next interaction. He called late one afternoon, his voice controlled, almost conciliatory. "I think we got off on the wrong foot," he said. "I don't want this to turn into something it doesn't need to be." "What do you think it's turning into?" I asked. "A standoff," he replied, "and that's not productive." "Productive." The word appeared again, like a refrain. "I want us to be aligned," he continued. "You're focusing on technicalities. I'm focusing on results." I did not interrupt. I let him talk. He explained his vision in broad strokes, describing a future where my property became part of a larger redevelopment plan, where its value increased, where I benefited from decisions he had already set in motion. "You'd thank me later," he said, not unkindly. "Once you see how it plays out." That was the moment I understood the depth of the divide between us. He was not trying to persuade me. He was narrating an outcome he considered inevitable, one in which my eventual gratitude would retroactively justify his actions. "You're asking me to trust that you know what's best for me," I said. "I do," he replied without hesitation. The silence that followed was absolute. It would have been easier if he had been cruel, easier if he had been greedy in obvious ways, easier if there had been malice to point to, but there was none. Only certainty. Only a conviction that his judgment outweighed mine. That made him more dangerous, not less. I realized then that confronting him with evidence would not change anything. He would reinterpret it, he would contextualize it, he would dismiss it as misunderstanding or fear. The facts themselves were not the battleground. The battleground was authority. In Mark's mind, authority belonged to whoever could see furthest ahead, whoever could anticipate consequences before others caught up. Consent was a courtesy, not a requirement. He believed that leadership meant moving first and apologizing later, if at all. Once I saw that clearly, my strategy crystallized. I did not need to expose him. I did not need to punish him. I needed to remove the conditions that allowed his certainty to operate unchecked. That meant shifting the conversation away from intent and toward structure. I began communicating exclusively through formal channels, emails with clear subject lines, requests for confirmation, statements of record. Each message was factual, restrained, impossible to spin without sounding unreasonable. At first, he pushed back. "You're turning this into a legal issue," he accused. "It already is," I replied. "You made it one." He accused me of being inflexible, of damaging family relationships, of prioritizing rules over people. I listened, without responding emotionally, noting the pattern. Every criticism framed my resistance as a moral failing. Every defense of his actions rested on the assumption that the ends would justify the means. What surprised me was how quickly others began to notice the shift. Without Mark acting as intermediary, planners asked more questions. Consultants requested direct input. The narrative he had constructed began to unravel, not through exposure, but through absence. Without his constant reinforcement, the assumptions he had planted lost momentum. That was when he tried a different approach. He suggested a compromise. "Let's bring in a mediator," he said. "Someone neutral. We can talk this out." Talk this out. As if the issue were communication, not consent. I declined. "This isn't a misunderstanding," I said. "It's a boundary." He did not take that well. "You're being rigid," he snapped. "You always have been." For the first time, there was anger in his voice, sharp and unguarded. I felt something then, but it was not fear. It was confirmation. I saw clearly now that his identity was bound up in being the one who solved problems for others. My refusal threatened that identity, not because it cost him money or reputation, but because it challenged his self-concept. That was the twist I had not anticipated at the beginning of this. Not that he was acting out of selfishness alone, but that he was acting out of belief. A belief system that left no room for my autonomy. Understanding that allowed me to let go of something I had been holding on to without realizing it. The hope that we could resolve this by reaching mutual understanding. There was no mutual understanding to be had. We were operating from incompatible premises. As that realization settled in, I made a decision that surprised even me. I stopped trying to stop the rezoning process entirely. Not because I accepted it, but because I recognized a deeper issue. If I fought every external move, I would remain reactive, always responding to initiatives Mark had already framed. Instead, I focused inward, on redefining what I was willing to give up and what I was not. The house, I realized, was not the core issue. My voice was, my right to choose was, and if preserving those meant relinquishing something else, I was prepared to do that. That understanding marked a turning point. The conflict was no longer about preventing a specific outcome. It was about asserting a principle that would shape every outcome that followed. When Mark called again, his tone brittle with frustration, I spoke calmly. "This isn't about the property," I said. "It's about you deciding things for me without my consent." "You're exaggerating," he replied. "No," I said. "I'm defining the issue." He fell silent. I realized then that the power dynamic had shifted again, not in my favor, but into a new phase. One where his certainty was no longer enough to carry him forward. One where systems, once engaged fully, would begin to constrain him. The twist was not that Mark was a villain. He was not. He was something more common and more insidious. He was a man who believed that competence excused control. And that belief, once exposed, would not survive contact with a system that required consent as its foundation. I did not know yet how it would end. But I knew this much with absolute certainty. I was no longer playing defense. And whatever I chose to let go of next would be a decision he could not reinterpret as his own. The moment I stopped trying to win and focused instead on executing, everything became simpler. I did not announce my next steps. I did not threaten or warn. I moved quietly, deliberately, using the same systems I had spent my career enforcing for other people. Systems worked best when you respected their rhythm. They did not respond well to urgency or emotion, but they responded reliably to documentation, consistency, and persistence. The first thing I did was remove myself from the story Mark had been telling. I submitted a formal statement to the planning department, clarifying my position, not as a rebuttal to my brother's claims, but as a standalone record. The language was neutral and unemotional. I stated that I was not pursuing rezoning, that any exploratory discussions conducted without my direct participation did not reflect my intent, and that I reserved the right to reconsider in the future on my own terms. I did not accuse Mark of misrepresentation. I did not mention his name. That omission was intentional. By refusing to frame the issue as a personal dispute, I forced the system to treat it as what it was, a matter of owner consent. That shifted the burden away from motives and onto procedure, where I was strongest. Next, I requested a complete log of all communications related to my parcel from the planning department, citing my rights under public records law. The request was standard, routine, difficult to refuse. It arrived 2 weeks later in a neatly organized digital file. I reviewed it carefully, highlighting patterns, but resisting the urge to annotate emotionally. Dates, names, phrases repeated across emails, assumptions carried forward without verification. I did not send this file to Mark. Instead, I sent a concise follow-up to the department acknowledging receipt, thanking them for their cooperation, and reiterating my position. Each message reinforced the same narrative. I was engaged, informed, and in control. At the same time, I took a step that felt counterintuitive but necessary. I listed my house, not publicly, not with a sign in the yard. I met quietly with a real estate attorney and discussed my options. I wanted to understand what flexibility I had, what leverage I could create if I chose to disengage from the property altogether. The conversation was practical, unsentimental. He explained timelines, contingencies, risks. I listened carefully. Walking out of his office, I felt lighter than I had in months. For the first time, I was not fighting to preserve a specific outcome. I was expanding my range of choices. That shift did not go unnoticed. Mark called when he learned, through channels I did not ask about, that I had consulted an attorney. "So this is what you're doing now?" he asked, incredulous. "You're going to blow everything up?" "I'm evaluating my options," I replied. "You're panicking," he said. "No," I said calmly. "I'm planning." He laughed, sharp and dismissive. "You're making a mistake. You'll lose leverage." I let the silence stretch before answering. "I don't need leverage over you." That was the truth. The leverage I was building was not against Mark. It was against the situation he had created, against the assumption that I would always prioritize stability over autonomy. The more I disengaged from his narrative, the more erratic his responses became. He sent long emails outlining potential gains I was throwing away. He forwarded articles about market trends. He reminded me, repeatedly, of how much he had already invested in helping me. I replied less and less. When I did respond, it was brief, factual, and final. I noticed a change in how others interacted with him as well. Without my implied consent reinforcing his authority, doors closed more quickly. Conversations he had initiated stalled. People began redirecting questions to me, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. The system was recalibrating. The final step was the most difficult, not because it was complicated, but because it required letting go of something I had once considered non-negotiable. I withdrew my participation entirely from the rezoning process, not by opposing it, not by lobbying against it. I simply declined to engage. I informed the department that I would not be pursuing any changes at this time and requested that my parcel be removed from further consideration unless I initiated contact directly. The request was granted. That decision had consequences. It closed off potential future options. It reduced hypothetical value. It simplified the situation in a way that could not be undone easily. It also removed Mark's last foothold. When he realized what I had done, his reaction was immediate and furious. "You just destroyed years of work," he said over the phone. "Your work," I corrected. You're being spiteful. I'm being clear. You're cutting off your nose to spite your face. I paused before responding. I'm choosing certainty over speculation. He did not understand that answer. He could not. To him, potential was everything. To me, potential without consent was just risk dressed up as opportunity. The conversation ended badly. Voices were raised. Accusations flew. For the first time, Mark accused me outright of betrayal. I listened, absorbing the words without letting them take root. Betrayal implied obligation. I felt none. After the call, I sat alone in my living room, the house quiet around me. I looked at the walls, the floors, the windows that had once represented security and continuity. I felt no attachment. That realization startled me, then steadied me. I had not lost anything essential. I had reclaimed something fundamental. The systems responded, as I expected them to. The rezoning file was closed. My parcel returned to its original classification. Notices stopped arriving. Calls ceased. The background noise of other people's plans faded. What remained was the relationship with my brother, altered beyond repair. Mark stopped calling. When we did speak, weeks later, it was stilted, formal. He no longer framed himself as my protector. I no longer needed him to be. The reaction from others was mixed. Some thought I had been foolish. Others admired my resolve. Most simply accepted the outcome and moved on, as people always do. What mattered was that the story no longer belonged to Mark. I had not exposed him. I had not punished him. I had simply stepped out of the role he had assigned me. That was the real counterattack. Not confrontation. Not revenge. Withdrawal. By refusing to participate in a future built without my consent, I had collapsed the entire structure he had been building around me. Standing in my kitchen one evening, watching the last light fade from the sky, I understood something with absolute clarity. Power does not always need to be taken back forcefully. Sometimes, it only needs to be denied the space to operate. And that denial, once enacted, changes everything that comes after. The aftermath was quieter than I expected. No dramatic fallout, no public reckoning. Just a gradual reordering of things, like a house settling after a storm has passed through. The house went on the market 3 weeks after the rezoning file was closed. This time, it was not hypothetical. I signed the listing agreement myself, sat across from the agent, and set a price that reflected reality, not potential. No speculation. No future upside. Just what it was worth. Exactly as it stood. When the agent asked why I was selling, I gave a simple answer. I'm done negotiating my life through intermediaries. She nodded, as if she understood more than I had said. Mark found out through a mutual acquaintance. He called me that night, his voice tight with disbelief. You're actually selling? He asked. After everything? Yes. Do you have any idea what you're walking away from? I do, I replied. He launched into numbers then. Comparables, growth curves, long-term projections. He spoke faster than usual, urgency creeping into his tone. It was the same pitch he had been refining for months, now stripped of patience and certainty. You're making an emotional decision, he said finally. You're letting this get personal. I waited until he stopped talking. This is personal, I said. That's the point. He went quiet. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. So that's it, he said. You'd rather burn it all down than admit you were wrong. I'm 7'd stand. I felt a flash of something then, not anger, but sadness. Not for the loss of the house, but for the way he still framed the world as a contest with winners and losers. I'm not trying to win, I said. I'm choosing what I'm willing to keep. The offer came quickly. A young couple, first-time buyers, eager and nervous. They loved the neighborhood. They asked about the schools. They noticed the way the light fell across the living room in the late afternoon. I answered their questions honestly. I did not embellish. I did not sell them a dream. When they made an offer slightly below asking, I accepted without negotiating. That decision puzzled the agent. We could counter, she suggested gently. I know, I said, but I don't want to. Signing the closing documents felt different this time. Not rushed, not pressured. Each page passed through my hands deliberately. I read every line, even the ones I had seen 100 times before. When it was done, I sat in my car in the parking lot, holding the envelope with the final paperwork inside. I did not cry. I did not feel triumphant. I felt resolved. The ethical twist of it all did not hit me until later, when a friend asked if I regretted not seeing it through, if I wished I had fought harder to preserve the future Mark had imagined for me. No, I said without hesitation, because that future required me to stay silent. Great fortitude and Venadian. That was the part no one seemed to understand at first. I had not given up the house because I was defeated. I had given it up because keeping it meant continuing to engage on terms I did not accept. Mark's reaction to the sale was swift and final. He accused me of sabotaging shared interests. He told family members I was impulsive, irrational, driven by pride. He said I had thrown away something valuable out of spite. I did not correct him. That decision, more than any other, marked the true end of our conflict. By refusing to defend myself in the court of family opinion, I denied him the last arena where his narrative could thrive. Let him believe what he needed to believe. Let others decide for themselves. What mattered was that the choice had been mine. In the weeks that followed, I downsized. A smaller place, closer to work, no yard to maintain, no long-term plans embedded in the soil. Friends asked if it felt like a loss. It feels like mobility, I said. The professional consequences were subtle but meaningful. Without the lingering perception of conflict, my work life stabilized. Questions stopped. Assumptions faded. My credibility, once strained by association, quietly restored itself. One afternoon, my supervisor stopped by my office. "I wanted to tell you," she said. "The way you handled that situation set a standard. Not everyone would have done it that way." "Done what?" I asked. "Chosen clarity over advantage," she replied. That was when I understood the full moral inversion of what had happened. Mark had believed that preserving potential justified overriding consent. I had chosen the opposite. I had sacrificed potential to preserve autonomy. The system had not rewarded that choice immediately or obviously, but it had respected it. Later, I received a message from Mark. Just one sentence. "You could have had more." "I know, friend." I stared at it for a long moment before typing my reply. "I already do." We have not spoken since. I do not know how his projects turned out. I do not follow his work. I no longer measure my life against outcomes he once promised. What I gained was not financial. It was not status. It was something quieter and harder to quantify. I regained the ability to say no without explaining myself. I regained the certainty that my consent mattered, even when it was inconvenient. And I learned that justice does not always look like restoration. Sometimes it looks like refusal, like stepping away from a table where the rules were written without you. The house is gone. The future Mark imagined for me will never exist. What exists instead is a life where every decision, every risk, every trade-off is mine alone. That is the ending I chose, and it is one I will never need to revise. The quiet that followed was not empty. It was deliberate. In the weeks after the move, I noticed how different my days felt when nothing was being negotiated behind my back. Mornings were still early. Coffee still tasted slightly burnt. Traffic still backed up at the same intersection. But there was no background tension humming beneath it all. No sense that something important was happening without my knowledge. I lived in a smaller apartment now. A clean, unremarkable building not far from the county offices. No yard, no long driveway, no marker stakes appearing overnight. I could lock the door and know, with certainty, that what happened inside my life would be decided by me. That certainty was not loud. It did not announce itself. It showed up in small moments. When a planner called to ask for clarification on a hypothetical scenario, I said no without softening the word. When a colleague hinted that I might want to be more flexible in future negotiations, I asked them to define what they meant. When a family member tried to reopen the conversation about Mark, I changed the subject calmly and did not circle back. At first, that unsettled people. They were used to me explaining myself, smoothing things over, making decisions feel collaborative even when they were mine alone. Removing that layer of accommodation felt abrupt, even cold. I did not correct that impression. Coldness, I learned, was often just clarity without apology. Mark never reached out again, not directly. I heard things through others, fragments and impressions, that he had moved on to other projects, that he was still frustrated, that he told the story his way, one where I was the obstacle he had not anticipated. I let him have that story. There was no part of me that needed him to understand. Understanding had never been the issue. Consent had. One evening, months later, I found the folder he had brought to my house that night, buried at the bottom of a box I had not unpacked. The manila cover was bent at the corner, my name still written on the tab in his careful handwriting. I sat on the floor and opened it. The pages were the same, the language unchanged. On paper, nothing about the document had ever been wrong. That was what made it so effective. It relied on trust, not deception. On familiarity, not force. I did not tear it up. I did not burn it. I placed it back in the folder, closed it, and threw it away with the rest of the trash. The sound of it hitting the bin was dull and unremarkable, final without ceremony. That was the nature of the ending I had chosen. Not dramatic, not vindictive, just complete. At work, new cases came in, new disputes, new homeowners convinced the rules should not apply to them. I listened. I explained. I enforced. The work felt cleaner now, less abstract. I understood more deeply what it meant to protect boundaries, not as theory, but as lived experience. When someone argued that outcomes mattered more than process, I met their gaze and said, "Process is what decides whose outcomes count." They did not always like that answer, but they respected it. Sometimes, late in the afternoon, when the building was quiet and the light slanted across my desk just right, I thought about the house I had sold. Not with regret, but with a kind of distant acknowledgement. It had been a chapter, an important one, but not the foundation of who I was. What defined me now was not what I owned, or what I might have gained if I had played along. It was the line I had drawn and refused to let anyone else redraw. People talk about justice as restoration, as getting back what was taken, as balance sheets evening out. This story did not end that way. I did not get the future Mark envisioned for me. I did not extract an apology. I did not watch anyone fall from grace. What I got instead was authorship. I became the final authority on my own life, not in theory, in practice. That kind of justice does not feel triumphant. It feels steady. It holds when no one is watching. It does not depend on recognition or agreement. It simply is. There are moments, still, when I catch myself pausing before a decision, listening for an external voice that no longer exists. When that happens, I take a breath and remind myself that silence is not absence. It is space. Space to choose. Space to refuse. Space to live without translating my needs into someone else's language. If there is a lesson in all of this, it is not about family or property or systems. It is about consent. About the quiet power of withdrawing it when it is no longer respected. Everything I believed was right did not collapse. It clarified. The systems I trusted did not fail me. They required me to engage them fully, without apology. And the price I paid was not too high. Because what I kept was something no one else could manage, optimize, or reframe on my behalf. I kept my voice, and that, in the end, was worth more than anything I walked away from.